te atua. Mā ngā ronga ki te whenua, a whakara pai ka ngā tangata katoa. Ko rangi uri te maunga, ko kaituna te awa, ko Himalaya te waka, ka Waitangi te kawanata, ko ihu karaiti te tangata me te atua, ti hei mauri ora. So I'm saying glory to God and peace on earth and goodwill to you all. And just talking about where I come from on this farm that Lydia talked about in the Bay of Plenty, te rohe o Tapuika, of the waka of Arawa. So, ka huri atu ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohe. Te Atiawa, ngā te Raukawa, ngā te Toa. Ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, o ka tuakana mā. Ki a koutou ngā mata waka kei wanganui a tātou e tēnei wā. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ki ngā tangata Pasifika hoki, ngā tuakana mā hoki, tēnā koutou katoa. Ka huri atu ki ngā tangata tiriti, o ko hoa mā, tēnā koutou. Ki a koutou no ngā hau e whā, those of you that have come from the four winds, this is my greeting to you also. Nō reira. Ka huri atu ki a koe e pā, ko taka whakawhetai tēnei a koe mō tēnei hui ngā. No e hoa ta whenua me oni tini mea te ao mā ngā tangata katoa e noho ane I runga. Father, I'm grateful for this gathering this morning, and we say, in line with your scriptures, that the earth is yours and everything in it belongs to you. Nō reira e pā. Nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai, kei wanganui I a tātou I tēnei ata. Ki a koe e te rangatira, Lydia. Ko tēnei te mihi, ki a koe hoki, te wahine toa. Thank you very much for taking the risk and inviting me to be amongst you this morning. And I count it a deep privilege, and I'm really thrilled to be here with you all. It's quite extraordinary that so many would give up their holidays to be stuck in a building like this. It's called foolishness, I think. It's a beautiful presence. E noho ana mātou, kei wanganui e te arawara o te atua. So we sit and dwell in the presence of the Lord. Nō reira, kia koutou katoa kua mihi. Kua mihi, kua mihi. So I've been invited to tell something of the New Zealand story, and it's really appropriate, I think, given that last song that we sang, Maranga, Oho Ake, Wake Up, Get Up, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so it's wonderful to be able to put in some thoughts around this. I have two sessions, a session now, then a session at 11 o'clock. It's a pretty grunty sort of offering that I've got for you this morning, so I hope that it's the morning shift, and that's a good time to deliver it, better than in the afternoon, I think. So it's my take on a story. I want to emphasize that very much, that it's my observation, my story about this land, and particularly related to the gospel coming to this land. I use the word advisably. It's not the definitive, all-encompassing story. It's taken through these eyes. In some ways, you could almost call it a prophetic interpretation of our history. And in that light, I offer it to you for you to judge. You are to test the spirit and just take on board the things that really fit for you, and things that don't fit, just leave it behind. And I'm trusting that some of it will be of benefit to you. I call my main argument, I guess, is that the gospel story to this land, or the gospel mission to this land, has been interrupted. So that's the kind of the core of the burden that I'm carrying. And so the first part in this session until 10:30, I'll be talking about God stuff, the arrival of and the being here in this God place, and in a way, and the reception that the gospel had in this land, especially by tangata whenua. In the next session, so the first session is somewhat kind of happy stuff. But after 11 o'clock, we dive into some stuff that is not so happy. But I hope that I will be able to leave you on a happy note as well. So we've all got to be happy, don't we? So that second part of it could be called "How do we enter into another's whare?" Or how do we enter into somebody else's house? This is a house where I've just been for the last 2 days, up in a place called Parihaka, a place where I've been going for many years, and that has helped formed my understanding of certain stories and things. So I want to frame it what we would call theologically. I want to frame it in the scriptures. This is not just a history or telling some history that stands apart from the purposes of God. I think Lydia was quoting from Psalm 33 before, that the purposes of God stand firm throughout all generations. And I believe very strongly that the purposes of God from the beginning to the end, they stand firm and they're unchanging. And so it's wanting to try and bring the history into an understanding of the strategies and the ways of God and the purposes of God, which stand firm throughout all generations. So I'm going to frame it. I've got two slides that are around the scriptures, and then we'll go into the storytelling. This is actually a remarkable passage in Acts 17. You know the story, I'm sure, many of you, where Paul stands before what's called the Areopagus. This is the ruling council in Athens. And he stands up before this religious people, and it's like he's answering the question that they would be asking in their mind: what's it all about? What's this life all about? What are we here for? And in a very short passage, it's almost like Paul puts it out there and explains it. I don't know if any of you are like me, but I get confused with a lot of the scriptures. That's a conversation I'll have with God one day and say, why didn't you make it a bit simple, maybe 1 to 10 or something? But, many of the places you've got to weave your way, find your, in the midst of Lamentations and Job and all of that, and try and sort it out. But there are a few passages where gratefully God has just allowed it to be put down in order. And this is one of those passages. So I'm going to read it and then interpret it and then go into the story. So Paul gets up and he says, just incidentally, this is my take on this is Paul is actually interpreting Genesis 1 to 3, what we call the Genesis mandate. Again, if you look at Genesis 1 to 3, you can see what's it all about and why we're here for. All right? So he says this: from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times and seasons in history and the boundaries of their lands, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move, and we have our being, even as some of your own prophets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. So Paul here is talking about the purposes of God, the strategies of God for humankind. And I think it was Bruce was talking about last night from Psalm 115, where the highest heavens belong to God, but the earth he has given to humankind. And we counter that with that almost that verse I quoted before, I think from Psalm 24, where the earth is the Lord's and everything in it belongs to him. So Bruce talked about that partnership And that's what I'm wanting to emphasize today. I want to emphasize perhaps an underestimated aspect of our relationship with God, and that's what He has given to us to do while we're here on earth. So this is what He says in short. He says, I want you to inhabit the whole earth. Well, basically He's saying to the people in the garden, He's saying, I want you to go from this place. I've created this beautiful creation, and I want you to go and I want you to basically have kids for a start. That's very important. You get some numbers up, and then I want you to go into all the ends of the earth and fill it. And when He says fill it, He's talking about, I want you to enculturate it. I want you to establish your humanhood in that place. I want you to establish your imago Dei. I want you to establish this image of God in every place where you go. I want you to be human and build a humanity that reflects the glory of God. He goes on to say that also that there are appointed times and there are appointed seasons for the different peoples. I want to suggest to us that these times and seasons, it's a very crucial thing to get a hold of. I think that many of you will understand the times and seasons about your own individual life, but there are times and seasons for your whānau, for your family. There are times and seasons for villages, for cities, for nations. There are times and seasons for people groups. This is what Paul was explaining about God's intentions for people groups. So one of the things is that he says is there will be rises and falls. You've heard about that rise and falls of civilizations. So that's what I call seasons. The ebbs and flows of the way things happen in our individual lives and also in our more corporate lives. And it's important that we understand what those seasons are all about. God establishes boundaries, land provision is what I call it. Now, this is one of the things about God. When He set out in the garden, He set out the strategies, He didn't just exit to another planet. He actually put something in motion, and the understanding in that is that I am your provider. I am the one that will oversee, I will provide for you. And one of the things I will provide for you is land, because that's what is necessary for our living and for our well-being. And another significant aspect about that, He says, I will mark out your boundaries. Boundaries are very important. You read Proverbs and it talks a lot about boundaries. The Old Testament talking about the children of Israel, it's very important. Don't shift the boundary stones. The reason for that, this thing of boundaries, and you could extrapolate from that into all kinds of areas, is without boundaries we have what's called social chaos. So God sets the wider strategy of going out, and He says, look, I'm going to provide a land, a place for you, your whānau, your hapu, your greater groupings. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are boundaries in that place, and I want you to acknowledge and understand and operate within those boundaries. But the most important thing He said was this: what are you going to do when you get there? You're going to seek God. So the whole purpose of the human condition is to be involved as culture makers, as creators of these places where we dwell. But the core aspect of our activity is to seek God. Okay, that's the culmination of, in a sense, of our human endeavor. And Paul says this. He said, "You know what? You'll find Him. When I send you out to all the areas of the earth and you establish your place in there, if you seek me, if you grope for me," the NIV says, "you'll find me." Why? Why, exactly as he says, because, as some of your own prophets have said, in Him we live and move and we have our being, and He's not far from any one of us. Okay? So this He's saying, one of the things we need to get a hold of here, this is not to Christians He's talking to. This is to everybody, all people groups. He's saying, if you search for me, you will find me, because I'm not far from any one of you. For some of us as good evangelical Christians, there's something a bit funny here. What is it? The thing is that Paul, to back up his cosmology or his defense of the gospel, as it were, uses two quotations from what he calls his prophets. You see that in Titus, and sometimes it's called their poets, but in Titus it's translated prophets. And this is Epimenides from Crete, and then Aristus from another part of the Middle East. He's using indigenous prophets to say, this is the word of the Lord, right? So again, I want to emphasize, these are not Christian prophets. They're not Abrahamic prophets. They're just prophets from a people group who have understood some things of the ways of God. So this is what we would call, just finish on this section, what we call, big fancy word that theologians use called providence. The providence of God. What is the providence of God? The providence of God is a word that says that God is present. He's involved in the activities. He's involved in what's going on, but we don't quite know how. It's sort of like he's there in the background. It's like he's doing all kinds of stuff now, and he's moving and shifting things in order that his purposes will be fulfilled. We don't know exactly how. That's what we call providence. So that's what we call general revelation, this thing that everybody has the opportunity to know God from the Middle East all the way out to the far-flung corners of the earth. Finish with a couple of scriptures here, beautiful scriptures from my favorite book, the book of Job. Job says, dominion and all, it's just so beautiful because it's so rich in poetry. Dominion and all belong to God. He establishes order in the heights of heaven, and these are but the outer fringes of his works. How faint the whisper we hear of him. Do you see that? Job, pre-biblical revelation stuff, he's seeing God in the creation. But he says, I can see you there, but it's just a faint whisper that I get of you. Job knows that what he understands from being told by the creation is only a faint whisper. Who then can understand the thunder of his power? One last scripture, which is, I think, quite an important one in terms of our story. The philosopher in the book of Ecclesiastes writes, he has made everything beautiful in his time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. What does that mean? Two things. Firstly, that in every human being, part of our DNA is that we have a God aspect to us that knows there is another reality besides this material plane. We're creatures that inherently know that there's the reality of the spirit realm. But the philosopher goes on to say, but we cannot tell what God has done from the beginning to the end. All right? So that means that it's like Job, people groups, they know something about the atuatanga, about God, but there's some aspects that we cannot understand. Here comes the gift of Scripture from beginning to end, which actually tells us all about Jesus and actually explains in depth about what's it all about and who this God thing is from beginning to end. So that's the scriptural basis. Now we're going to give it a go. I'm going to have a shot at actually telling, what could that look like here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? What does that look like? So if we're using Acts 17, from one man he made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, we see the migration of Polynesia, or the Polynesian migration. Let's just pick it up on the east coast of Asia, coming down from Taiwan or Formosa, and there's just this extraordinary movement of this people group whom we call Polynesians that started there and over a period of centuries sailed down with various island stops along the way and ended up in the South Pacific. So we say that God marked out their times and their seasons, right? So in the various seasons, the different migrations happened. What I'm saying in this is that these seasons of migrations were not accidental. But somehow, if God is God and if he's involved in people, there is a movement of God in the midst of these migrations, right? And also, God also marked out the boundaries of their lands. How does that work? It works in the sense that we are people who hear from God. We understand such things as wisdom, protocols. We can call it tikanga, and we establish those boundaries ourselves. That's part of the fact of our inherited stewardship when we move from place to place. So I'm just very quickly moving along on the story. So if we see the movement coming down from the North Pacific, and I'm saying that there is some seasons of God. I want to suggest, as I've put down on this list here, you see some of the significant movements of people into this land. I call that they were all part of the seasons of God. Somehow, not perfectly, but God is involved in these migrations, right from Kupe in 900 AD and the other waka, right down to the arrival of the gospel on Christmas Day in 1814. I want to use this man named Kupe, not because he's necessarily the one or the only one. I'm using him a little bit as an archetype, and I acknowledge that different iwi and hapu and whānau have their own interpretations. But I want to use Kupe as a kind of a type of the one, of a representative of the Polynesian people that came down here. So in 900 AD, Kupe comes down here from Hawaii, and he discovers, along with his wife, this land, and along with some others, and he named it, or she named it, Aotearoa. Kupe is a fallen person, just like all of us, but carries the DNA of eternity in his heart, according to Ecclesiastes 3. Another thing that Kupe carried in terms of his understanding was what I call the revelation of Io matua kore. Now, whether it was Kupe or somebody else, there was an understanding of the reality of the kaihanga o ngā mea katoa, the creator of all things, this creator God, this parentless one that somehow came from Hawaii and found resident in this land. There were an understanding in the different iwi, different hapu, and among different priests around the reality of this creator God. That's important because it suggests to us that Paul was right in Acts 17 around the fact that if you seek God, you will find him, even though we see but a shadow of him. So he carried also within him what I call the Genesis Commission, or it's a commission of kaitiakitanga. That's actually coming, being in a place, and establishing your culture. So providentially, by the hand of God, not accidentally, these navigational exploits took place. Amazing navigation from all up and down the Pacific and backwards and forwards, way ahead of some of the Western navigational abilities at the time. They came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, which I say is providentially provided to Māori as the tangata whenua, as the first people of the land. Not again accidentally, but actually providentially. He was given, or they were given, dominion, according to Genesis 1:28, or we could call that mana whenua. These are my translations, and they may need some adapting. Mana whenua, kaitiakitanga, stewardship, tino rangatiratanga. What is tino rangatiratanga? It's the aspect of authority. It's the aspect of naming, for example, naming places. That's putting the human authority over locations, marking boundaries. That's a gift of God to every people group. Not only that, but they also were given responsibilities. So it's not only a matter of rights, but every people group, according to, if we look at the model of the children of Israel, were given the call to also provide hospitality. And so my forefathers in 1867 received hospitality from tangata whenua. That's a season. Another season happened. We call it difficult beginnings. It's what I call the beginning of the encounter between Pākehā and Māori. Abel Tasman, James Cook. Abel Tasman had an encounter, left, there were people dead. James Cook had an encounter, people dead. Murderers Bay, Poverty Bay. These were the beginnings of our encounter. And I want to suggest that there were cultural clashes there, and we didn't get off to a very good start. 3 years before the arrival of James Cook, there was a Ngāti Kahungunu matakiti or seer or prophet who said this: there are people coming. There is a new people coming, and the name of their God will be the son who was killed. Te tama I Rorokutia. He's a good God. However, the people will still be oppressed. So this was a person that was raised up and began to prepare the people of Aotearoa for the coming of my ancestors. Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without notifying his servants, the prophets. The prophet Amos said. The next wave, the next seasons were what I call were the sealers and whalers. So Tasman, Cook, go back to Europe. They tell everybody there what an extraordinary place it is down in the Pacific. Come, there's whales there, there's seals there. All we need for developing our industry in terms of getting oil, etc. So a whole wave of migration started from Europe and brought these European sealers and whalers. And they were not, on the whole, a very nice bunch, actually. But in the meantime, and this is an important thing that I think Roshan has already talked to you, this was what was happening here in New Zealand, had something else happening in the UK, and there was a group of Christians who will call themselves the Clapham sect, William Wilberforce and others. These were people that were influenced by the Wesleyan revival. They had not only a burden for evangelism and for saving souls, but they had a social conscience and a real burden for social justice. So they were the ones who were actually involved in forming the mission group that first came to New Zealand, this Church Mission Society. So William Wilberforce, for example, was one of the people, the anti-slavery man, who actually helped propel the first mission endeavors to New Zealand. Now, the key thing about that is that when the missionaries came here to this land, they had a slightly different perspective than what was held centuries before when people went to India and to South America. Now, as we'll see, it's not perfect, but it was actually a lot better than what had gone previously. The key thing is that they understood that everyone was made in the image of God and therefore should receive a kind of a mana because of that. I'm talking about God's providence again, God's strategies, God's hand. Two important people in that providence was a man called Samuel Marston, and he was the one who I mentioned had been influenced by William Wilberforce to come out to Australia and then further on to New Zealand, and he became the leader of the Church Missionary Society. And he met a very important chief from the north. His name was Ruatara. Now, Ruatara, like many other people up in the north, began to sail across the world because the ships were coming in here. So they would hop on the ships and then they would do their thing in those different places. What happened was that Marston met Ruatara in London. Ruatara had been refused entry into London at the time. He was a sick man on the ship, and Marston befriended him, and he began this engagement of a friendship. I'm going to take a few more minutes, and we'll all right, and we'll bite into my other session. Yeah. So Ruatara became a friend of Marston, and ultimately Ruatara invited him to Northland. This is another important fact, that every mission endeavor that I understand in this country was an invited mission endeavor. It wasn't just, CMS saying we're going to go to the ends of the earth and just set up our flagpole in that place. They came in response. So Marston came, preached his first sermon in Oihi up in Rangihoa on Christmas Day of 1814, carrying this gospel. The beautiful thing was that when he arrived in 1814, he was greeted by 400 toa from Ngapuhi, and they did what's called the Hari o Ngapuhi, and it's this prophetic haka, really. And the prophetic haka talks about the pipi wharaurua, which is the shining cuckoo, which a bird that lays its eggs in another person's nest. But you can see at the end there, it says, there's a change coming. There's a change coming, and it is good. It is good. The mission didn't go very well. From 1814 to 1830, there were only 2 baptisms. Now, as an evangelist, that's pretty disheartening. One of them was actually a northern Maria Ringa, a northern princess who actually married a Danish trader, and she had to get baptized in order to marry him. So that left one. But come into the scene was this man called Henry Williams, and he took over the leadership. He actually was resident here. He was an ex-naval captain, fought in the Napoleonic Wars. And when he arrived, it says that the New Zealand mission was fruitless and in confusion. But he set about to rebuild this. When he arrived, he came in the midst of what I call a technological upheaval. I actually talk about it because, in my view, it's one of the keys to the gospel. It's one of the keys why ultimately the gospel became received. Utu is a form of repayment. It's a form of restoring balance, restoring mana in times of clashes, and that either families or hapu would engage in this reciprocal eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It was done in the former times just with a patu or something like that, and there was not a lot of carnage, and things were actually sorted out, not too bad. But when the muskets arrived, things changed dramatically. And they arrived up north, and Ngapuhi, they still wear it till this day. But over 20,000 people were killed at that time. And Williams found himself in the midst of this bloodshed. And one of the things that he did was he lived in the midst of the people, and he became not only a person who taught scriptures and who translated scriptures and who learnt Māori, but one of his key endeavors was actually what I call peacemaking. This is an extraordinary photo of him going with the Wakatoa from up north down to Tauranga Moana. That's his sailing ship. So he would sail down in the midst of these Utu warring groups, basically seeking to say, hey, there's another way. And there's some wonderful stories of him engaging with Ngāpuhi Rangatira. And he became a person of real mana. As a result of these endeavors, by 1845 it's said that over 65,000 Māori were engaging in some kind of what we call whakamoimete hui, gatherings of praise, both midweek and on a Sunday. It was, by any stretch of the imagination, just the most extraordinary revival. So if we figure there were about 90 to 100,000 Māori at the time, we say 45 to 50,000 were engaging in active Christian relationships. And the main reason for that was obviously the bravery of those early missionaries, but the key issue was actually the providence of God and what I call and the indigenous evangelists. Oh, that's not. What's that time say? 5 minutes to go or over? To go. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting to grips with this technology. Oh, that's awesome. Oh, I see. Oh, I thought I was over time already. Oh, I'm going to finish on this story that many of you will know about. Grace, a better word than utu. Grace, a better word than repaying evil with evil. This is a story that many of you from this area will know well, but some of you won't, so I'll rehearse it. I live in a place called Tauranga Moana, which is on the back of the Kaimai, and over the other side is a place called Matamata. The tribe there is called Ngāti Haua. Charlotte Brown and Alfred Brown were two CMS missionaries. They established their mission station in this place, and a young girl named Terore was raised in the school there, and she was given a Bible by Charlotte Brown. Ngāti Hauwā were, like many tribes, had a relationship of tension with some of the neighbouring iwi or hapun. One of them was Ngāti Whakauai from Rotorua. And they heard, Hauwā heard that the Ngāti Whakauai were coming with a raiding party. And so what they did was a group of them actually left Waharoa and went up over the kaimais and they wanted to escape to Tauranga to find their place of refuge there. You can see as you're going along the Matamata Highway, there's a big waterfall there called Wairere, and you can climb up there, and that's where they went. So Ngā Kuku was the father of Terore, and a few missionaries went up there, and they camped overnight at the top of the kaimai, and unfortunately in the middle of the night, the Ngāti Whakauai raiding party that was led by a man called Pāora Te Uata came and ambushed them, and Terore was killed. The rest of them fled, went back to Ngāti Hauwā, and as I said, that Terore, she was given this Bible, well actually it was just the Gospel of Luke, and Pāora Te Uata took the Gospel of Luke out of Terore's pocket. Now I want to share this because this is the providence of God at work. So anyway, of course, Ngā Kuku returns back to Ngāti Hauwā, and of course, when they heard all about it, what was their first reaction? Their first reaction was to rise up and to say, we will avenge this to restore our mana. Ngā Kuku stands in the midst of them and says, no, we now follow another way. We are following the way of grace. So immediately we see how the gospel of peace had its first impact. The story goes on that the little Gospel of Luke goes back to Rotorua, to Ngāti Whakauai, and then around that time there was all the slaves, many slaves had been... Okay, I'll carry on talking until we find the report. Many slaves had been released, right, and they were returning back to their lands. Carry on? Okay. So one of them was a Ngāti Raukawa man. His name was Ripahau. So on his way back, he calls into Ngāti Raukawa up there and also to Ngāti Whakauai, and he meets Pāora Te Uata. And they bring out this little gospel of Luke, and of course they can't read or write. So not only does Ripahau know how to read and write, but he's also become a Christian up, like so many others, up in the mission stations. He explains it. False alarm, shall I carry on? Okay. So he explains it to them. One of the beautiful stories is that Pāora Te Uata goes back to Ngāti Hauwā, and there's stories in Brown's journal, the missionary, of them being together. Pāora Te Uata and Ngā Kuku, the father of the daughter he murdered, being in services worshipping God together. This is another example of this grace of God at work. It doesn't stop there. Ripahau comes back. He's from this area, Otaki, Ngāti Raukawa. He brings with him a few pages of the Gospel of Luke, and he meets two very important men down here, Matene Te Whiwhi and Tamihana Te Rauparaha. Right. He begins to talk to them. They go out to Kapiti Island, and they have a wānanga out there, and he begins to talk to them about the gospel of this Gospel of Luke. They immediately get in a ship, head up to the Bay of Islands, and say to the CMS, we want some missionaries to come to our land, to our place, to our village. And a man called Octavius Hatfield, a very skinny, sickly Pākehā, comes down here and establishes this place. The story finishes really with Tamihana Te Rauparaha becoming a believer, and then heading down to the South Island. Now, you know the story of Ngāti Toa and Ngaitahu, enmities to Rauparaha. Tamihana Te Rauparaha's father had been down there before and done some pretty severe damage to Ngaitahu. He goes down there, and this is what the cry was when he got down there to Tamihana Te Rauparaha. They said, Have you come to finish the work of your father? And Tamihana Te Raupraha finishes and responds to them and says, he indeed will not come, for I have come to bring to you an end to warfare and to bind peace by virtue of the words of the gospel of the Lord. That message went all the way down to Rakiura, Stewart Island, a message that started in the pocket of a little girl. This is the unseen hand of God that works in the shadows as we give ourselves to Him. Okay? Just finally, and we'll finish on this, Martine Te Whiwhi and Tamihana Te Raupraha were key in the foundation of the Kingitanga movement and the setting up of that whole thing. And that, again, came out of a biblical or scriptural inspiration. So this is the way that this thing has unfolded. So we'll finish on that. We're in revival mode. The whole nation is being turned upside down, and people are praising the Lord. All right? So that's where we finish it.